on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, as we continue our long national process of debriefing from the election results. This past week, we want to look at the insights of an organization I think very highly of, which is the Revolving Door Project here in Washington, D.C. Max Moran, who is joining me now as research director for the personnel team at the Revolving Door Project. And in a second, we can talk about what that means. And the Revolving Door Project's director, Jeff Hauser, also issued a statement on behalf of the group about the election results, especially in Virginia, which I'd like to talk about. So without any further ado, Max Moran, research director at the Revolving Door Project. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So let's start with this. What does the research director for the personnel team of the Revolving Door Project do?
That's a great question. So Revolving Door Project in general is sort of a watchdog and educational organization focused on the federal executive branch. We think that there's a very large and excellent progressive ecosystem that focuses on pushing for big wins in Congress and legislative change there. There are some organizations, not enough, but some which focus on the judiciary, but there aren't really any other groups in the progressive ecosystem that are focused very directly on the executive branch, on what the president does all day, the federal bureaucracy, and so on. So we try to both, one, educate and inform the public about how exactly the president's job and president's work operates, and two, how very often this is corrupted and co-opted by corporate interests, by the extremely wealthy, and how the same regulators and agencies are supposed to be creating a more equal and a more prosperous nation for all of us, instead serve the interests of the very wealthy. So on the personnel team, which I lead, we do a great deal of research on individuals who Biden or the president, whoever it may be, is either considering or nominating for different positions across the executive branch, being cabinet secretaries or heads of agencies and so on, in order to find out what, if any, history they have serving corporate interests, either directly as like lobbyists or things like that, or association with different ideological movements that are aligned against the public interest and so on, in order to try to get a sense of how this person might use their powers and whether they're going to use them for the public or if they're going to use them for a handful of very powerful, very wealthy individuals.
Which is such important work. And I know that, the Biden administration, for example, has been an interesting mixed bag, to say the least, and that where a lot of appointees, I'll just speak from my own personal experience and opinion on this, but a lot of appointees, let's say in foreign policy, military affairs, I would describe personally as a disappointment, including some people that come out of what I would call the neoconservative world. There are other appointees in this administration who I would call surprisingly and refreshingly good. I mean, I think the two most prominent examples being Lina Khan at the FTC and Rohit Chopra to run the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, both really excellent thinkers as well as managers in these fields. So, short version, you have an interesting job. And do you ever get involved in, when an administration changes, an enormous number of positions are filled by the incoming president. Do you ever get involved in identifying good candidates or ones that the incoming administration might not have considered?
It's a great question. First of all, I would very strongly second your analysis of the administration overall. I think that there have been some really positive gains on some of the domestic economic focused agencies. Again, Lina Khan, Rohit Chopra being like the absolute standout examples. But especially within foreign policy, you have a continuation of the really quite disturbing neoconservative and also just generally neoliberal types of philosophies and perspectives in various other parts of the administration. As far as us recommending individuals for different positions, we do some of that. We very deliberately don't do as much. We work with a broad range of other organizations that work on a very broad spectrum of issues in very deep depth. Those other organizations tend to, be trying to maintain positive relationships within the administration, tend to be, working and reaching out very directly with individuals and so on. Whereas we're designed very deliberately to be able to criticize whoever we want or need to, and to be able to sort of say things that no one else is saying. Politico described us during the transition as the professional thorns in Biden's side, and that's a moniker that we take very, very seriously and very proudly. So while we do some direct recommendation of nominees every now and again, we very much, a major ethos of our organization is being willing to say whatever needs to be said and being willing to criticize whoever needs to be criticized. So that sometimes requires us to more so play the stick than the carrot, as it were.
No, I fully understand. And as someone who let's just say I feel I occupy a similar place in the ecosystem. So I understand that, you can't be everybody's friend all the time. Sometimes you have to tell truth to power. And I understand that. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you this week, Max, was we had the election on Tuesday. Everybody has heard about it ad nauseum. Everybody in the Democratic sphere universe has tried to play it as a vindication for, or proof that they've been right all along and all that, as you guys wrote in your piece, confirming our priors. But you wrote a great, you all, I mean, it was, I assume it was a collective effort. Jeff Hauser, went out under his name, but a statement issued yesterday basically saying that, confirming our priors, to use that phrase, doesn't mean we're wrong. We want to know what happened, and we want to understand modern communications, and particularly taking aim with the idea that people like Joe Biden and Terry McAuliffe are, well, what I would characterize as helpless victims of circumstance. You guys really push back on that, and I wonder if you wanted to say a couple words about that.
Glad to. So our major analysis of both the race in Virginia and what we're seeing right now, very concerningly from the Biden administration, is that these are both Biden and McAuliffe, that is, are extremely powerful men who are convincing themselves that they are helpless, in large part because they don't want to publicly make any enemies. In some ways, this sort of gets back to the ethos of revolving door, which I was just talking about a little bit. We are very clearly living through a moment of very real, very important and justified and good populist anger in the United States and in the world, frankly, right now. People can tell and people can feel that something has gone very dramatically wrong with the bargain, as it were, that America was said to offer. Someone has to identify what has gone wrong, why it has gone wrong, and show very clearly that they are going to fight back against that. Right now, a lot of the leaders in the Democratic Party do not want to do that because they do not want to identify the actual cause, which is corporations, the extremely wealthy, the neoliberal ideology under which we have lived for 20, 30 years or so, or 40 years, depending on how far back you want to go. That's a question for historians. You have this for a very broad range of reasons, like, political elites are elites. They don't want to make enemies of their own friends. They don't want to, run the risk of losing campaign donations. They, from a revolving door perspective, they also want to be able to get highly paid, cushy lobbying jobs when they leave power. But our point here is if you don't provide people with an enemy, if you don't identify what the cause of the problem is and show that you are going to fight against that problem, somebody else is going to. That somebody else is going to be the, extremely far right, I would say fascists that, run much of the Republican Party at this point and are evidently a very powerful rising force within American politics. They are going to identify, for one thing, the wrong enemy, the wrong cause of what's gone wrong. But more importantly, the people who they are going to identify are the most vulnerable within society. It is extremely important. It's the fundamental stuff of politics, really, for a political leader to identify who their enemies are and to make it clear who they stand for and who they stand against, especially in a moment of populist fervor like we are living in right now. If you don't do that, someone else is going to do that for you. They're going to name you as their enemy. That's what we're seeing right now with Biden. That's what we saw right now with McAuliffe, who couldn't name Glenn Youngkin's Glenn Youngkin's association with the Carlyle Group as his enemy because McAuliffe himself was invested in the Carlyle Group. And if you don't do that, again, there are very grave consequences.
In my own writing, my own post-mortem of the Virginia election and the elections overall, one of the things I pointed out was that that 71%, I think I'm getting these numbers right, of Terry McAuliffe's voters thought that Virginia's economy was going in the right direction. 75% of Glenn Youngkin's voters thought that Virginia's economy was going in the wrong direction, which suggests to me that that people who are struggling economically in a state like Virginia are increasingly turning to the Republican Party. This, to me, totally reinforces what you just said, Max Moran, because it suggests, and of course, if you look at the top line numbers, Democrats still do better among lower income people, so on. So I'm not overextending this fact, but to me, it is significant that people, when they're struggling, are going to look for an explanation. They're going to look for a negative. They're going to look for something behind it, which will, of course, be their enemy, right? Because it's hurting them. And that if Democrats don't want to name the antagonist in people's lives because they depend on that antagonist for contributions, what have you, then Republicans have an open field to say, well, it's the people trying to make you get a vaccine. It's the people, whatever, it's critical race theory. In other words, which you mentioned, in other words, none of these tactics, but I'm interested in your thoughts, of course, it seems to me none of these tactics can find a foothold, or it'll be harder for them to find a foothold if Democrats are saying, no, this is what's really happening to you. And I think part of what you're saying is the absence of that straightforward narrative is part of the problem.
Absolutely. I think, like you just said, if there isn't a clearly identified alternate explanation for what the cause of the problem is, then Republicans are going to be saying, oh, it's, this imagined version of critical race theory. It's people trying to get you a vaccine, and so on. Like you mentioned, Democrats do still overall do better among lower income voters. But again, you can't discuss any of these shifts without mentioning the decline of the labor movement. One of the major reasons that Democrats were once identified with working class voters and so on is that they were the party of labor. They were the party that reinforced and that fought for labor's needs and labor's goals. That's coupled especially with a dearth of local media and local media period, much less progressive local media, creates very real problems getting out an alternate message. And so it's crucial, one, not just that Biden identify antagonists, identify corporations, extremely wealthy. And again, like we were discussing, figures like Lina Khan, like Rohit Chopra and so on, some of his appointees and some of his nominees very clearly, understand this and very clearly understand the ways in which the finance industry or tech monopolies and so on have very directly harmed people and are very, very willing to go after those targets. And that's the other part of our point here is that it's not as if Biden lacks any power to actually directly target these things. A lot of Democratic Party pundits and so on have said, well, what was Biden supposed to do because Congress refuses to pass these infrastructure bills, which is often sort of a way to varying degrees of codedness of saying because progressives won't give up their efforts to try to actually make the infrastructure bills help average people. Well, the answer is that Biden is the president of the United States of America. He is not helpless, far from it. He wields this extraordinary executive branch and has extraordinary powers to directly target white-collar crime, to directly target corporate law breaking, and to directly name names and say, these are the problems and we're going after them. If he fails to do that, then why should anyone vote for him? Why should anyone support him? Because they don't know what he stands for.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because your comment, as well as the two pieces you wrote, and the second one on the Revolving Door Project.substack.com newsletter is entitled "Quit Whining and Start Presidenting!" ! It reminded me a lot of something that happened in the second term of the Obama administration, when there was suddenly a flood of articles by commentators who were close to the administration, and I mean, I won't name names, but Ezra Klein, and so on, saying, the president can only do too much, and the president has limited power. And I actually wrote a piece, and it was many people, not just one, and I actually wrote a piece on the new genre of helpless president lit that was out there, that the president was like, little Nell tied to the railroad track with, and the point being that I think you're absolutely right, but I found it fascinating that this rhetoric has begun to resurface in yet another Democratic administration, at yet another critical turning point for the economy. And I mean, maybe it's good for, and I don't mean this as cynically as it sounds, maybe it's good for fundraising to say, we're helpless against, the lies about the critical race theory unless you help us now. And it probably is good for fundraising, but I think it begs the question of what a tough party fighting for people's interests would do in a case like that, and what a president in particular would do if he or she was fully willing to use the powers at their command.
Absolutely. I'd say a large part of why Revolving Door Project was founded was sort of to push back against that narrative from especially the second term of Obama onwards, when he had lost control of Congress. And so there was a lot of folks in the pundit class and so on who just kept on saying, well, what are you supposed to do? He doesn't have control of Congress. I was like, well, he's the president. He has a lot of things that he can do. In Biden's case, the classic example is that he can cancel student loan debts, almost like 95% of it, with one signature. Why haven't you? That's an enormous thing which you can do to indicate on whose side you are and to uplift a lot of struggling people. The president, again, can initiate a massive crackdown on white-collar crime. We're living through an absolute cataclysm of both public cases of corporate executives just getting away with whatever they want to, of a massive number of incredibly wealthy grifters and so on. And so just again, reasserting rules, reasserting laws that are on the books, but just have not been enforced for a very long time. And then very publicly making it extreme, making a point of saying in public, I am fighting for you and against X. Not a large amount of Biden's own rhetoric, both during the campaign and today, has been in this notion of trying to reunify the country, has been this notion of trying to, put partisan politics behind us, which is the same thing that every Democrat has promised for about 40 years. And what you have instead is I'm blanking on the specific numbers off the top of my head, but there was reporting that basically there's the largest partisan gap in perceptions of Biden, second largest number partisan gap in perceptions of Biden, only behind Donald Trump. We are living in a very polarized time. People are extremely angry and they need some explanation for why things are going so wrong. Right now, only one party is putting that forward, and only one party is willing to directly prosecute and attack their targets. That party is prosecuting and attacking the most vulnerable people in society. What we need instead is a party that is going to name the actual cause of these problems and make it very clear that they are fighting that fight.
And, you talked about one of the ideas that I thought was great was, well, first of all, I just love the tone because it's activist in nature of what you guys are writing. And you mentioned the fact that Glenn Youngkin's firm, the Carlyle Group, fired thousands of unionized workers to make money, which is a perfect thing to run on in any state in this country, but that Terry McAuliffe couldn't really make hay out of that because he's a Carlyle investor, which happens over and over again. But then you also talk about if the Biden administration is so worried about supply chain disruptions, why isn't it tackling the ultimate cause of that problem, corporate greed? Why isn't there a supply chain profiteering task force, which reminds me of an idea I'm actually going to talk to you guys about offline. But, and then the third one that you mentioned, which reminds me of a meeting I and some other journalists had with Tim Geithner in 2010. Why is the transportation secretary claiming that the most important effort to tackle supply chain issues is to, quote unquote, put the pandemic behind us rather than using federal law? This reminded me, Max, of the story that came out yesterday, and it was, I want to see confirmation, but I think it's true that someone in the Biden administration said they did not want to extend the student debt repayment moratorium beyond early 2022 because that would send the signal that the economic crisis is continuing. In other words, it's almost like if you pretend it's gone, which seems to me what the transportation secretary is saying too. Let's pretend to put the pandemic behind us rather than looking at the root causes of our supply chain problem using federal law. Is that a fair summary of what you guys are saying?
I think so, most certainly. I think the tidbit you mentioned about we can't extend the student loan moratorium because we don't want to send a signal that the economic crisis is continuing. It's like, okay, who do you think you're sending the signal to? The only people who would be affected by such a signal would be incredibly wealthy investors who are trying to decide if they want to be bullish or bearish in the stock market and that kind of thing. It's like, that's not really who is going to be turning out to vote for you. It's who might donate to you. But as we saw with McAuliffe, donations do not always equal votes. Donations do not always equal on the ground enthusiasm. As far as supply chains and all of that go, again, if this is a very real concern for the Biden administration, as well it should be, well, you have a transportation secretary, you have various international secretaries, you have various tools for identifying, what the causes of this problem are and for trying to resolve it. And you can make a very public show of using those tools. For another thing, it's the pandemic sort of exposed all of this, but the real cause of supply chain shortages is corporate greed. Is that it's been just standard practice for 20, 30 years or so for everything to only arrive just in time and for there to be no redundancies whatsoever in the economy, because that lets those companies have to spend less on the actual operations of their firm and they can give more money back to their shareholders. You can very publicly tell that story and very publicly say, no more, we are not allowing that anymore. you don't have to just sort of sit and cower and say, well, like, I guess these are the hands that we've been dealt, and we're really trying our best here, guys. No, that you're the president of the United States. You weren't elected to occasionally give speeches and to mostly just sort of like shrug to the press and say, well, I hope that things turn out. You were elected to solve problems, so start solving problems.
Well, amen. And again, we're talking with Max Moran of the Revolving Door Project, and the tragedy, of course, is that both during Obama's administration and now, the public would react, I think, with such enthusiasm to that I think it's a tragedy it's not being done, and I think in the rare cases where it is done, it gets a good hearing. And you mentioned, this piece mentions, I should say, the pollster and consultant David Shore, who I've written about as well, and he and his acolytes, his acolytes like to discuss popularism, quote unquote, the idea that the polling average around items you mentioned in TV ads or speeches determines your popularity as a politician, and the gist of it being, that if you as a Democratic candidate are for 5 things and 2 of them poll really well and 3 of them don't, just talk about the 2 that poll really well. Now, I've had my own critiques of that in the past, but including part of the role of a politician is to educate and enlighten and change minds and not just cater to the opinions people already have. But all that aside, you guys bring them up to say there are no hegemonic nightly news programs anymore, and what conflicts are they initiating? Now, I think that was interesting, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting you, but I took that to mean that the whole concept of popularism, quote unquote, and why it's caught on with some people is because it's conflict averse, right? You don't get into any messy arguments about, we should break up the big banks. And then somebody's going to say, no, why would you do that? Then you have to have an argument around the issues. The whole concept behind that, it seems to me, which is endemic in a lot of Democratic Party politics, is no, don't bring up things somebody might disagree with. And I think part of what you're saying is, no, you have to have that conflict to get a breakthrough and really reach voters. But I don't want to speak for you. Is that something like what you're saying?
That's absolutely what we are saying. The idea that if you just avoid conflict, if you just say things that are popular, and if you don't say things which aren't popular, that's a very nice little, catchy little coiny kind of thing. And a lot of people have critiqued the ideological arguments behind this. Yourself, Osita Noenevu at the New Republic has a fantastic piece about it. I would just say, as far as just a pure political messaging strategy, Terry McAuliffe didn't talk a lot about critical race theory in his own campaign, but that entire campaign came to be about this imagined, distorted, nonsense version of critical race theory. Terry McAuliffe, I'm sure, talked a great deal about very popular things.
Yeah.
Absolutely none of that stuck. If you are not defining your antagonist is being defined for you. That's what it means to live through a time of populist revolt. And moreover, just a little more technically, that's what it means to not have some sort of a hegemonic media source, at least for folks on the center to the left. Fox News and OAN and so on fill that role on the right. But again, those folks are going to be talking nonstop about whatever imagined, dog whistle happens to be their favorite for this week. If you want something to garner the attention of wherever, of the multiplicitous ways people get their national news or don't get their national news at all, if they're just scrolling through Twitter or Facebook or whatever, if you want something to break through all of the noise, you need to have a clear conflict in mind. I mean, it's kind of just a basic of storytelling, right? There has to be a conflict. You need to have something which you stand against, which defines what you stand for. The idea that if you just keep on saying popular things, if you just keep on saying things that are avoiding a fight of some sort, is pretending as if you it's pretending again as if you can avoid conflict, as if like, if you aren't defining your antagonist, well, you are being defined as someone else's antagonist. You are leaving that door open, so don't do that.
Well, in a sense, Terry McAuliffe did try to define his opponent by saying he was Donald Trump, but it didn't. To me, it was Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign all over again. Now, Hillary Clinton carried Virginia, but she was running against the actual Trump. I think that attempt, that was, to me, an issues-free, an issue-less way of trying to define his opponent. And then all Glenn Young kind of had to do was walk out in his folksy fleece vest, which is like, dude, it's 80 degrees out in Virginia. Why are you wearing that? But that was all he had to do to shoot that down. And I think what you're really talking about is defining your opponent with something people can get their teeth into, like, the workers of Virginia are working families of Virginia are trying to get by every day, and you're laying off 5,000 people to make money with your hedge fund firm. I mean, I think that's the kind of defining you're talking about, right?
Well, certainly. Because also defining your opponent as like Donald Trump is just not a relevant conversation in the year 2021. Donald Trump is just a private citizen at this point. So you want to define an antagonist that has a real meaning to people's actual lives. Again, like, your private equity firm has laid off hundreds of people, many of them unionized, so that you can make more money. That is terrible. That is relevant to any working person who has ever feared to lose their job, any working person who has lost their job. There you go. Big oil firms, you are destroying the planet for profit, and it is time for you to answer for the lies that you have told us for 40, 50 years. Everybody wants a habitable planet. That is a very clear, very obvious thing. You have to, you cannot afford not to be making clear what forces in society are causing people very real problems, connecting that back to people's very real struggles, and to be making clear how you are going to stand up to them. And that, I think, is the lesson which the Democratic Party, if it's smart, which is a big if, will hopefully take away from the Virginia results.
And Max Moran, I know this piece ends. The story of the midterm elections will depend on whether Biden chooses to spend the next 12 months focusing on speechifying pablum or substantive corporate accountability. So you guys will be monitoring that. Any closing thoughts before I let you go?
Just that it's been an absolute pleasure. You can expect a lot more from us about the concept of corporate accountability and what Biden can do right now in order to enact it and to define his antagonists. We'll be having a lot more on that in the coming months. And here's hoping for a better future.
All right. And where can people go to find more information about Revolving Door Project?
You can check us out at therevolvingdoorproject.org and at Revolving Door DC on Twitter.
Great. Well, Max Moran, research director for the personnel team at the Revolving Door Project. I knew I was going to get it wrong at least once, but thanks for the great work you guys are doing, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.